Something remarkable took root in the city of Miletus roughly 600 years before the Christian era. The place was a commercial hub. Goods, tongues, and mental habits from Egypt, Babylon, and the wider Greek world all passed through its harbors. Out of this ferment stepped a figure whom later ages would anoint as the very first philosopher. His name was Thales, and his claim has echoed down the centuries. Water, he said, is the ultimate stuff of everything. The suggestion sounds almost childish. Yet buried within it lies a move of extraordinary boldness. Thales set aside the divine machinery of epic and myth and asked instead what the world, considered simply on its own terms, might actually be. We begin our survey of the Presocratics with him because, in a sense, the whole enterprise begins with him. The question Thales of Miletus asked has echoed through 25 centuries of Western thought. Look around you. The sea churns. The season cycle. Living things emerge, flourish, and dissolve back into the earth. Is there anything that holds steady beneath this relentless parade of change? Thales suspected there must be. His question, stripped to its core, is this: might we identify a single originating stuff, one fundamental reality, from which everything arises and into which everything finally subsides? The question pulls in two directions at once. The first points outward, toward the cosmos. What, in the end, is the world made of? The second points inward, toward the very structure of reality. How can anything abide while everything around it shifts? Notice what is not being asked. No appeal to Zeus. No genealogy of divine powers. The inquiry turns away from the poets and their tales and stares directly at the things themselves. The answer Thales will give matters less, at this moment, than the sheer audacity of asking the question this way. That is the threshold of philosophy. We possess no writings by Thales himself. Our entire picture of his thought must be assembled from later reports. The weightiest witness, by a considerable margin, is Aristotle. In the Metaphysics, on the heavens, and on the soul, the Stagirite hands down the doctrines he associates with the Milesian. Water as the first principle, the earth riding upon it, and the curious claim that all things swarm with gods. Alongside Aristotle stand the doxographers, Simplicius, Aetius, Diogenes Laertius, compilers who gathered notices about earlier thinkers long after the fact. This state of the evidence breeds an intractable problem. Thales himself wrote nothing that has survived. Every scrap of testimony reaches us through authors working 2, 5, or 8 centuries after his death, and they inevitably read his ideas through lenses he could never have recognized. To read Thales is to listen for a voice that comes to us only as an echo, refracted across multiple layers of transmission. Caution is not optional, it is the very condition of the enterprise. Miletus occupied a singular position in the 6th century before the Common Era. Perched on the Ionian coast, it commanded the sea lanes between the Aegean and the wealthy civilizations of the Near East. Goods, tongues, and mental habits flowed through its harbor incessantly. Just as important was what the city lacked. Unlike Egypt or Babylon, Miletus had no powerful priestly caste policing the boundaries of acceptable belief. Homer and Hesiod supplied a shared imaginative landscape, but no one was obliged to treat their verses as binding truth. Ancient sources credit Thales with travels to Egypt, where he acquired geometric skill, and with sufficient command of Babylonian astronomy to forecast the eclipse of 585 BCE. In both cultures, water already figured as a primordial element, none in Egyptian cosmology, Apsu and Tiamat in Mesopotamian myth. Thales did not invent the idea that water came first. His innovation lay elsewhere. He stripped the gods from the story. The water he proposed was not a divinity to be worshipped, but a principle to be understood. That desacralization marks the true beginning of philosophy. We have reached the doctrinal core of Thales's philosophy. The indispensable testimony comes down to us from Aristotle, in the opening book of the Metaphysics. The English translation of the Greek text reads, Thales, then, the founder of this kind of philosophy, declares the principle to be water. Every term in this deceptively simple sentence carries weight. Compressed within it lies nothing less than the founding charter of Western thought. The pivotal word is archê. In the ordinary Greek of the 6th century before the Common Era, archê meant simply, beginning, or rule. But under the pressure of emerging philosophical inquiry, the term acquires a new density that will prove permanent. Archê comes to designate that from which all things originate, that in which they consist at the deepest level of their being, and that to which they finally return when they perish. Thales is water, then, is not merely the liquid we drink, though it includes that too. It is the abiding substrate underlying the whole of reality, the one thing that remains self-identical while every appearance shifts and dissolves around it. But why water, of all things? Aristotle offers a conjecture, and it carries considerable plausibility. Thales arrived at this view by observing several converging natural phenomena. The nutriment of every living thing is invariably moist. The seeds of all beings, the very principle of generation, possess a wet nature. Heat itself appears to arise from moisture, as though moisture were its source and sustenance. To this we may add an observation available to any attentive mind in Miletus. Water is the one substance we regularly encounter in all three states: solid, liquid, and vapor. This plasticity makes it an especially suitable candidate for explaining material transformation without abandoning the unity of the principle. Yet the specific choice of water matters less than the structure of the claim itself. Thales asserts that there is one archê, a single, unifying principle. Confronted with the overwhelming multiplicity of things, with the ceaseless parade of phenomena that our senses register, thought dares to postulate an underlying unity. This is the decisive step, reducing the many to the one, discerning beneath shifting diversity something permanent and intelligible. From this gesture forward, Greek philosophy will unfold as a series of rival answers to the very question Thales first posed. What is the archê? What, in the end, is everything? The conversation has begun. Thales of Miletus left us no written chain of reasoning. Given the source problems we have already discussed, this is hardly surprising. Nevertheless, the later philosophical tradition has reconstructed, from the testimonies that do survive, the likely grounds upon which he rested his claim that water is the universal principle. These grounds should not be mistaken for formal logical deductions in the Aristotelian manner. They are better understood as a cluster of convergent observations, which, taken together, rendered the primacy of water not only plausible but compelling. Let us examine the four main grounds. The first ground is cosmological in character. Thales maintained that the earth rests upon water. He did not picture it suspended in empty space, nor held aloft by divine hands. Rather, it floats upon an immense aquatic mass, much as a log floats upon the sea. The notion strikes modern ears as primitive, yet it possessed considerable explanatory power. Earthquakes, terrifying events for ancient peoples, could be understood as nothing more than disturbances in that subterranean water. Water, then, was not only the origin of things. It was also the permanent physical support of the inhabited world. The second ground is biological in nature. The most elementary observation reveals that every living thing requires moisture to exist. The nutriment that sustains plants, animals, and human beings is invariably moist. Seeds, the very principle of generation, possess a wet nature. A body utterly devoid of moisture is not a living being but a corpse. Water, Thales concluded, must be the very condition of life. The third ground appeals to the observable transformations of matter. Water is the one substance we commonly encounter in all three physical states: solid as ice, liquid as flowing water, vaporous as steam. This plasticity makes it the ideal candidate for explaining how a single underlying reality can manifest itself in such diverse forms while remaining essentially what it is. The fourth ground arises from the immediate experience of an inhabitant of Miletus. In that port city, its gaze permanently turned toward the Aegean Sea, water presented itself as the most dynamic and omnipresent element. It surrounds the land on every side. It falls from the sky as life-giving rain. It rises from the earth in inexhaustible springs. It returns ceaselessly to the sea through the beds of rivers, in a cycle that the ancients already recognized. This ubiquity and this constant dynamism suggested that water was not merely one element among others. It was the very principle of motion and change. Taken together, these four grounds constitute the earliest documented effort to furnish a rational, unified account of the cosmos. To claim that water is the principle of all things is not to make an isolated assertion. Like any genuine philosophical thesis, it unfolds consequences that reach far beyond its immediate statement. Once accepted, it compels us to rethink the nature of the cosmos, the structure of reality, the place of the divine, and the very method by which we come to know anything at all. These consequences, which Thales himself likely never spelled out, but which his thought contains in embryonic form, are what elevate his figure above mere historical curiosity. Let us examine the four fundamental consequences of his claim. The first consequence is cosmological. If everything that exists ultimately proceeds from water and returns to it, then the universe is not a chaotic aggregate of disconnected realities. It is, rather, an ordered, unitary whole, a cosmos in the full Greek sense of the term, a beautiful and harmonious totality precisely because it is governed by a single underlying principle. The world is rationally intelligible because it possesses an intelligible structure. The second consequence is properly metaphysical. Thales's thesis establishes, for the first time in the recorded history of Western thought, that reality is not exhausted by what the senses perceive. There exists a deeper level, not evident to casual inspection, which reason alone can access. The distinction between appearance and reality, a fault line that will run through the entire subsequent history of philosophy, is inaugurated here. The third consequence concerns the divine. Aristotle transmits an enigmatic remark attributed to Thales: everything is full of gods. How are we to understand this in light of his water thesis? If water is the principle of life and motion, and if water permeates everything, then nature as a whole must be in some sense animate. The divine does not dwell in a separate sphere, beyond or above the world. It is immanent within reality itself, saturating it completely. We are no longer dealing with the traditional polytheism of the Homeric narratives. What we encounter instead is the earliest documented sketch of what might be called a naturalistic pantheism. The divine principle is identified with the material principle of the cosmos. The fourth consequence is methodological, and perhaps the most decisive of all. If the world can be explained by reference to a natural principle such as water, then it is no longer necessary to invoke divine genealogies or inherited mythic storylines. To understand reality, it suffices to observe nature attentively and to reason from what one observes. This gesture, modest as it may appear, inaugurates what later centuries will call scientific philosophical thought. Thales had no need to summon Oceanus or Tethys to explain why the earth shakes or why things change. It was enough for him to look at the sea, the sky, and living beings, and to ask what they had in common. Reading Thales means navigating a series of persistent puzzles, none of which admit of easy resolution. There is, to begin with, the question of scope. Did he actually propose that everything, here and now, is water? Or did he advance the more restrained thesis that water is the originating source, the ultimate substrate from which things arise and to which they return? Most commentators lean toward the latter, but unanimity remains elusive. Then there is the matter of category. If Thales was offering a physical hypothesis, then he was the first natural philosopher. But if his water functions more like a symbolic placeholder, a way of gesturing toward an underlying unity, then he might better be described as the first metaphysician. The texts we have do not settle the matter. A further difficulty is baked into the very nature of our evidence. We do not encounter Thales directly. We encounter him through Aristotle, whose own philosophical commitments were already fully formed and who had every reason to present his predecessors as groping toward conclusions he himself would eventually secure. Disentangling the historical Milesian from the Aristotelian portrait is a task that may simply exceed our sources. And then there is that stubborn fragment: everything is full of gods. Hylozoism? Pantheism? A stray remark about the ubiquity of motion? The surviving testimony is too meager to adjudicate. What we are left with is not a doctrine but an invitation to interpret. Scholars have disagreed sharply about what to make of Thales. Werner Jaeger, whose Paideia shaped a generation of classical studies, saw him as the decisive transitional figure, the man through whom myth gave way to logos. On this reading, Thales' water is not so much a physical element as an embryonic metaphysical category, the first halting effort to grasp the unity that lies beneath the world's teeming multiplicity. A very different voice enters with Geoffrey Kirk. Kirk urged restraint. The fragments, he insisted, are simply too meager to support the weight of a systematic cosmology. Thales, in his view, was a man of practical accomplishments, astronomy, engineering, statecraft, but not a speculative philosopher in any robust sense. Against this skepticism, Jonathan Barnes mounted a defense. Thales, he argued, did exactly what the tradition says he did. He staked out a universal claim and adduced reasons in its favor. That the reasons strike us as weak by modern standards is beside the point. They were reasons, offered in earnest, and that is what matters. Aristotle, on this account, did not conjure Thales' philosophy out of thin air. He transmitted it, filtered no doubt through his own conceptual vocabulary, but without wholesale distortion. The debate, like so much in the study of the Presocratics, remains live. Barring the discovery of new evidence, it is likely to stay that way. We have reached the end of our lesson on Thales of Miletus. 3 points deserve to be held onto. The first is this: Thales was the first human being, so far as the historical record attests, to ask the question that inaugurates philosophy. Confronted with a world in relentless flux, he sought something that abides, a single principle capable of accounting for the sheer multiplicity of things. And he did so without once appealing to divine genealogies or inherited storylines. That gesture alone earns him the title of first philosopher. The second point bears on his answer. Thales proposed water as the archê, that from which everything arises, in which everything consists, and to which everything finally returns. This was no arbitrary fancy. He grounded it in careful observation. Nutriment is moist, seeds are moist, water alone assumes every visible form of matter. His answer may strike us now as inadequate, even naive, but it was a reasoned answer, and that is what matters. The third point concerns what endures. The lasting legacy of Thales is not water. It is the path he cleared. After him, explaining the world would mean less and less telling stories about gods and more observing nature and giving reasons. Philosophy, science, the rational investigation of reality, all of it begins with his question. That is why we close with this thought. The significance of Thales lies not in his answer, but in the fact that he dared to ask. For those wishing to pursue the study of Thales and the Presocratics further, 3 works stand out. The indispensable primary sources remain the Aristotelian passages already cited, the first book of the Metaphysics, on the heavens, and on the soul. As for secondary literature, Werner Jaeger's monumental Paideia, The Ideals of Greek Culture, provides what has become the canonical interpretation of the transition from myth to logos, a transition in which Thales figures as the decisive turning point. Alongside it, the collaborative volume by Kirk, Raven, and Schofield, The Presocratic Philosophers, has held its place for decades as the standard critical guide. To these may be added Jonathan Barnes's meticulous early Greek philosophy. Here ends our journey through the thought of Thales. In our next lesson, we will remain within the Milesian school, analyzing the position of his disciple Anaximander. We therefore invite you to join us there. Thank you for your attention. Until next time.